And a very good afternoon to you all joining us online. This is a live session from COP26 in Glasgow. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this third of our weekly webinars, bringing you news and insights from parliamentarians and others who are taking part at COP26. Today is the fourth day of COP. We have a lot to report on. We've had 2 days from the Leader Summit, Monday and Tuesday, and we're joined by 3 to 4 key colleagues from the World Resources Institute. This webinar is held in partnership with E3G and with WRI, and we're delighted that Stientje from Veldhoven is able to join us. Stientje is a former parliamentarian and leads on the parliamentary engagement work with the World Resources Institute. We also welcome Marcelo de Andrade from Brazil, and Marcelo is a sustainability pioneer and sustainable finance expert, the founder of ProNatura International, and also the co-founder of Earth Capital worldwide and in Brazil. We also have Barry Gardiner, Member of Parliament from the United Kingdom, who has been very engaged in the last couple of days. And in particular, Barry, of course, today is the Energy Day, and I know that you have to leave us early to join other activities that are taking place with Climate Parliament. And our fourth panelist will be Representative Deputy Sam Onuigbo from the Nigerian Parliament, and we're hoping that he doesn't have connectivity problems and that he'll be joining us shortly. But this is very much a live session, so please bear with us. There will be gremlins to bear with, and I hope that everybody can hear each other, but so let's get started. So we've had a really busy last few days. There's been a flood of announcements. It's been really hard to keep up with the churn of the COP presidency's publicity team. There's an agreement almost announced every other minute. So Barry, I'd like to start with you because we've had some really surprising, unexpected announcements, in particular with regard to net zero from a range of countries. So why don't we get your thoughts on the last couple of days? What have been some of the highlights for you?
Well, I think the highlight for me was certainly Mia Mottley's speech, actually, because, I mean, there was enough power there. Here we are on Energy Day. There was enough power in that one woman to you know, provide all the energy for a small island developing state in herself. She was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And she laid out, I thought, the three key things that have to be addressed this week. She talked about the mitigation gap, she talked about the finance gap, and she talked about the adaptation gap. And you know, yesterday at Finance Day, I think started off very well. You had the announcements from Carney on that's the former governor of the Bank of England and former, I think, the key Treasury Bank of Canada as well before that. So key figure in all of this. And he made this announcement about the alignment of all these global companies worth 40% of all assets, all global assets, 130 trillion of them. And how that was going to be a game changer because they were going to align towards the 1.5 target. The trouble was that he then could not specify what the criteria for that alignment would be. And when he was actually challenged on radio about would it mean that a company, for example, couldn't finance a coal-fired power station any longer, he sort of backed off. And I think one of the things that many of us who are veterans of COP become wary of is these grand announcements that don't actually have the infrastructure, the structure beneath them to develop and actually implement the commitments that are the high-level sound bites. So it's going to be really important, I think, to say, well, what does this alignment mean for these companies? Is there going to be a fossil fuel filter on investment? If there's not, it really isn't worth the paper that it's written on. But, you know, that's, I think, what we need to see out of this next 7 or 8 days.
Thanks a lot. So Barry, you of course have been involved in this super scrutiny committee. that has scrutinized the UK government's, the presidency's own engagement in the process. And that's provided a vehicle for holding ministers to account very much, and for raising the kind of probing questions that you're mentioning now need to occur with regard to these big deals which are being announced without really an undergirding of fact and detail. So what would your message be to parliamentarians who are gathered here and listening to these major announcements, very bold, very daring, very mesmerizing in the case of the 130 trillion, but we need to look under the bonnet. So what's the message for legislators?
Well, look, you're right. It is look under the bonnet. That's exactly the message that we need. Because we have in Parliament, and I'm sure this is replicated in many other parliaments, we have a select committee structure that is able to look at the commitments government makes and hold their feet to the fire. And this is what is so critical in all of this. Because let me give you an example. Last week in the UK, we had the budget. And in that budget, the Chancellor made reference to the super tax deductions, which he had actually previously announced, and said these were the way to get productivity booming in Britain again. What he wasn't able to say, of course, was that those super tax deductions, that's 130% tax deductibles, would have a fossil fuel filter on them. Now, if you look at something like the Cambo oil field, which is being developed off the shores of Shetland in northern Scotland, the islands of Shetland, you'll find that there we're talking about a production facility that would be from now till 2050, costing billions of pounds in terms of the infrastructure and the capital invested in that. Who's going to pay for that? Not Sika, who are the founders, or the finders rather, the developers, not Shell, who own 30% of it. We are. The UK taxpayer is actually going to be paying not only 100% of the development costs, but giving those companies a 30% bonus subsidy on top for polluting our atmosphere to the tune of 18 coal-fired power stations running non-stop for a year. That's the actual impact. And so the way in which we integrate the finance with the reality of what the finance is doing is absolutely vital. And it's really important that select committees, that members of Parliament are holding the government to account for these things. Look, there are many other examples I could give, but I'm really keen to hear from Stientje and others about what their experience is as well.
So Stientje, let's bring you in that case. You've been following things very closely. And of course, you know, we've had some quite eye-watering announcements, you know, whether it's on deforestation, whether it's the slew of finance commitments which were made by the private finance sector in particular yesterday. So what's your take on the credibility gap, in a sense, that Barry was referring to?
We need those commitments because they show that the world wants to move in that direction, and we need to remain credible in the process that we agreed in Paris, namely voluntary commitments on the basis of concrete action. But then, of course, it's just like Barry said, it's crucial to really look under the bonnet. And I must say that the work on transparency, the Paris rulebook and transparency, I think that is also where the negotiations are going to be really difficult, but also really crucial. Because if you have a commitment, you don't have transparency, you actually don't have a commitment at all, right? So on the one hand, I think we should commend the UK presidency for the atmosphere that they've created here. Because if you walk around here at COP, you can see all of the announcements, you can see the community coming together, making the statements, saying that more action is needed, and that does really help. I mean, we now have 90% of the global economy covered by net zero commitments. I mean, we would be in such a different stage if we would not have those commitments. But just a commitment is not enough. It's a prerequisite for action, but now we really need to go to action. And to have action and to have that accountability, we need transparency. So I think that the transparency point is probably also going to be one of the most difficult issues in the negotiations, because it will mean holding governments accountable to what they've actually said and how they are delivering on it. And that is why this is so crucial. And having been a parliamentarian myself for 7 years, also having been in government in the Netherlands, I have experienced how structuring this transparency and accountability works. Because what you need is a constant, basically a daily drive to start delivering. We have so little time. So these delivery processes, these delivery mechanisms are going to be key for our success. We need the commitments. We need to commend people for putting the commitments on the table, and we need to use those commitments as a base of saying, okay, now show me how you're going to do it. Without that second step, that we will not get where we need to be, especially since we have so little time. And parliamentarians across the world can play an incredible role in making sure that when you hear those commitments, you say, that's fantastic. Even though perhaps coming from a Green Party, you feel we should do more, or coming from a party that's concerned about what does it mean for people, you want to ask about what does this mean for people, and how do we make sure that everybody can actually make that transition. Public support, equity, also in developed countries, it's really crucial, right? That we make this transition with our constituents. We need the accountability and the transparency, and we need to see the concrete steps.
Thank you. I would just want to drill down a little bit deeper into mechanisms for enhancing transparency. So, of course, within the Paris Agreement, we do have this provision for the enhanced transparency framework, how that's going to work. And legislators need to understand that better. We also have the slew of finance commitments, and also in particular on coal. The making coal history agenda has just taken off, it seems. The Secretary General announced that there would be a committee which would try and provide some governance for the environmental integrity to be maintained. So we have these mechanisms within the Paris Agreement at the level of the UN Secretary General. What do we need to see more of at the national level? Because when the finance comes home, it's going to come home at the central government level. There's a whole set of settlements which will need to be entered into at the subnational level. So Barry, before you're able to leave us, before you have to leave us, if I can just come back to you to ask about scrutiny and the enhanced transparency, the mechanisms that we now need to be talking about and implementing.
Sure, Malini, I confess that I'm not familiar with the elements of the Paris Agreement about transparency, and so that's something, if I'm not familiar with it, and I've been around this for some 15 years or more, that it probably means that most of my colleagues aren't familiar with it either. So I need to get my head around that and to see how that can help us within the national parliaments to do just that, to make sure that we have transparent oversight and that we can then scrutinize and hold to account properly. So I'm afraid I hold my hands up here to my own ignorance, but it's always better to do that because you can learn that way. So as I said before, that we have a load of mechanisms within Parliament, whether those are select committees, whether they're question times, holding ministers to account, where we can do this. But what we need to do is we need to be knowing what the right questions are to ask. And that's why actually engaging and being here at COP is so important, because this is how we find out exactly what are the questions that we can ask, what are the ways in which we can make sure that government is living up to the commitments that they've made. And of course it begins with knowing, it's the same with when you look at any environmental landscape, the first thing to do is to know what you've got. Know what those commitments are from the government, know what you're actually holding them to, and then see how they're delivering on it. And that's the work that I think certainly in our parliament the select committees do very well. They're aided and abetted by the all-party parliamentary groups, which have specific focus very often on net zero or on climate change or on conservation, and we can drill down in those small sessions, those small seminars, in a way that very often is not possible in the chamber of the Parliament itself. So the other thing, of course, is to produce the reports that we do, which then government has to respond to. So a select committee will produce a report, and the government is obliged to respond to that. They can't wriggle out of it. They may not give you the answers that you want, but at least they do have to answer the questions. So you sent me my homework. I will go away and find out more about exactly what the transparency mechanisms are and how they can help me in doing my work in Parliament. But you can be sure I'll be trying to hold their feet to the fire.
Well, Barry, thank you very much. And your honest admission is shared by all of us, because these are intensely complex negotiations. There's not just the COP taking place, there's the CMP, there's the CMA. I mean, there's a whole set of treaties and commitments underneath and accompanying the Paris Agreement. And to be honest, none of us are experts. We all need to steep ourselves a bit more, and that's why we're here, and that's why we're having these kind of webinars. So I think the key thing is to have the structures within parliaments to provide the scrutiny, to hold government to account, to get those answers, but also you can't make them bend to your will. That's the role of the public. So how to make those reports that you are publishing available to the public so citizens can do the next thing, which is their role in holding the government feet to the fire.
Malini, look, getting public engagement on this, I think, is absolutely right. You know, I want to say that the work that you did in encouraging us to have those sessions for youth leaders to come and grill us as MPs is really important, but it's got to be wider than that. And I think what we need to see is something like the public debate that we had in the UK, where we collected a number of the select committees got together and they held these series of public seminars to ask the people what they thought on all the key topics to do with climate. And the wonderful thing, you know, is that actually very often where government had felt reluctant to go, the public said, no, that's pretty obvious, actually. You do need to do that. And this is why I think that report was actually so important, because it was by an informed public, completely selected, you know, appropriately, with all sorts of different views. So it was done not in random selection, but very deliberately to represent a cross-section of the entire population. But I think it's reports like that that give government the confidence that it needs sometimes to move into areas that it's otherwise thought, maybe the public won't like us going there. But I also think this needs to be done at a local level. That was a great initiative. It was something that I think was really positive at a national level. But I actually think that we as legislators need to be doing that in our own communities, in our own constituencies, with our own public, and holding public meetings. So it's not just going along to your local Friends of the Earth meeting, or, you know, it's actually having a public engagement where people feel that they can come, ask, you know, the stupid questions, ask the questions that, because no question is stupid in this game, but ask those questions, have them properly answered, have their concerns and their worries taken seriously. And if we engage as legislators with our own constituents, then I think that will do so much to actually drive the agenda forward. Look, I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to leave you now, but it's been great to join with you briefly. Marcelo, I'm sorry not to have heard you yet, but no doubt we'll connect another time. And Malini, thanks very much
looking
again.
Forward to that.
Thank you very much, Barry. And of course, we're recording everything today, so delighted to have you for the time that we did, and we hope that you'll have a chance also to view the recording afterwards. But we'll definitely pick up on these issues later. Have a wonderful afternoon. So Marcelo, I'd like to move over to you. Of course, we've seen some really surprising announcements come out, especially with regard to net zero. So I'm thinking of Nigeria's announcement, where President Buhari announced that the country would seek a 2060 net zero target year. The same thing for Modi. Prime Minister Modi announced a net zero target for India for 2070. We've also seen some announcements come out of Brazil, and I'd be particularly interested in your take on the decarbonization agenda, the engagement of the central banks, private finance, and its implications for halting deforestation in Brazil. So over to you for your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Malini. Well, it has been a very, very long journey, and I think we shared this journey, and for many years. And I think finally we've gotten to a place where we can really see private capital being seriously dedicated or invested on this sectors, on this area. I can see Brazil, for example, committing to several things. I think it's really going to happen this time. I would like to offer one example of one state which I think is very significant, and I've been involved for 3 decades right now, and I've seen the fruition of that. Mato Grosso state is the largest producer of grains of agribusiness in Brazil. If you were a country, would have been the 4th largest producer in the world. We started working with this country, with the state in mid-90s, and helped them get a $450 million loan from the World Bank. This is government money, government to government money. That investment was really well done. It's called ProNatura. That investment was really well done, and it facilitated and catalyzed the large agribusiness boom that we see today in Mato Grosso, all driven by private sector. Now, it's not necessarily carbon friendly. It hasn't been this way. And I started again working with the previous governor 10 years ago, and with the present government, it's announced something that started then that I helped create, and they basically announced yesterday that they're going to decarbonize and they're going to get to a net zero stage of the state of Mato Grosso. And the interesting aspect of it is the government won't invest 1 cent, not even with subsidies. They are creating the legislative framework and facilitating and catalyzing private sector investments into turning the economy into climate friendly. It's very interesting. Something of that scale is really, really important. And it proves that it's possible to be done. All of the large companies in the world, the big trading companies, the big market companies, I mean, I won't mention names, but believe me, all the big ones work there. And their investments, their capital is going to be deployed to fulfill this commitment from the state. It's very interesting. I believe that bringing the example to this side of the pond, I would have an example as the offshore wind power UK. Started with subsidies, government finance, multilateral, and all of that. Now it's mostly, if not all, private sector. So it's interesting the role that legislation and public money can play to catalyze private investment. But I believe sincerely that we're going to get out of the mess that we put ourselves in with private capital investment, which was the same capital that created the mess in the first place. So we need the same scale. We need the same kind of capital to now do the right thing, because now I'm not blaming anybody, because back then nobody knew what's going to happen. This is just about having the appropriate technology, which we have now, and the appropriate legislative and incentive basis for that capital to be deployed properly and make the right turn to achieve our goals of 1.5 degrees.
Thank you. And Marcelo, yesterday, Mark Carney, of course, was very much in the news with his announcement. But we also heard from Nigel Topic, who's the high-level climate change champion. And Nigel reminded that actually there's a study by Vivid Economics which suggests that we need $30 trillion in order, from finance, $30 trillion of investment over the coming decade to keep the 1.5C targets alive by the end of the decade, and that 70% of the bulk of this money has to come from the private sector. So the situation you're describing is an illustration of that already beginning to happen in Brazil, and the steps which have been taken by one of the leading states towards that direction. Stientje, I know that you want to come in on this. So whether it's on finance or whether it's on some of the other major issues around adaptation, forest loss and damage, please, over to you now.
Oh, just 1 second, Malini, and Stientje, just 1 second. I'd like to back your example of Nigel Topic. Nigel we've been colleagues in the board of a large corporation in the past, and I really admire him. And I think whatever he says, I'll give it 20% upgrade, because he's very discreet and very low profile and conservative. So I would really take it seriously. Sorry, I just wanted to make this comment.
Thank you for the endorsement. That's fantastic. Stientje.
Yeah, well, let me make that endorsement again then, because Nigel is indeed fantastic. And I think I can only underline what he said. And indeed, I wanted to follow up, because I think we were talking about transparency and about finance both. What can you do as a parliamentarian, right? What are the instruments that you have? I would like to start indeed with the follow-up on the finance element. You can make sure you create the condition for government-wide progress, right? This shouldn't just be about a climate minister doing things for climate. This is where the incentives across the government make all the difference. And indeed, legislation, I just wanted to highlight another example where it has been greatly effective in transport decarbonization. We had European rules on the reduction of CO2 emissions in vehicles. And those rules created change so much faster than any governmental subsidy could have done, because they did so for a large consumer market, and they generated growth instead of generating higher taxes for citizens. So legislation is a fantastic and very, very powerful instrument, and parliamentarians decide on the legislation in their country, right? So you have an incredible role there. Then a little bit back still to this question of what can you do to enhance transparency? When new commitments are being made, ask two questions. Is it new, and what's the baseline? And if you have those two very key questions in your mind, I'm sure those questions are really hard to answer if the commitments are not as good as they should be, right? So what's new and what's the baseline? Second, make sure there is a process of independent assessment of the government's achievements on a regular basis. As a minister, I had to report on a yearly basis on the progress that I made. And that absolutely made sure that I was continuing to drive this progress. Okay, I'm very intrinsically motivated, as you might know, but it also really helped to have that structure throughout the government. And third, and this is really crucial, make sure there is the independent data which is compiled and collected. And that also means financing those people that are collecting the data. For example, with the World Resources Institute, we are now covering the change in forestation, the change in land use up to 10 square meters. So it's really granular data. And you need that kind of data to actually prove that the commitments that were new with a clear baseline, etc., and progress is being made. So let's make sure that together we also ensure that we have independent data available to be able to hold our governments accountable.
Thank you very much. And Stientje, one of the great things about COP26 is that we have a lot more parliamentary networks who are working together. So for the first time in the UNFCCC, we have an informal group of parliamentarians. So Globe is very honored to be serving as the focal point for the parliamentary group. And this is a constituency that needs to be better organized within the UNFCCC, because it's still surprising that when you look at the announcements which are being made, the manifestos which are being shared, the absence of the word legislator or parliament. So this is, as you've mentioned, I mean, we need to have a proactive agenda, because we've seen the benefits of lawmaking. And of course, scrutiny and the accountability is very often mentioned, but the lead that policymakers, that legislators as policymakers can also take on this agenda. So looking ahead, because we've just been looking back over the last few days, of course, today's the Energy Day. Tomorrow is the Youth and the Public Empowerment Day. And we have some big marches planned, the Fridays for the Future March tomorrow, and then the very large march involving many different climate coalitions calling for climate justice on Saturday. So just looking ahead to the next couple of days, what is your hope and expectation of what we may see, which propels us towards that acceleration and ambition that we want to see as an outcome? Stientje, let me come back to you, and then I will come to you, Marcelo.
Thank you so much. There's so much going on that I wouldn't dare to assume that I would know in every area where there'll be a lot of commitments and what the outcome could be. But I think, for example, in transport, we will be seeing at the Transport Day real commitments to drive decarbonization of transport, and not just, let's say, electric cars, but also freight transportation. think if you look at the contribution of freight, it's really crucial that we also start to decarbonize freight, and I expect there to be real announcements. Also, active mobility is going to be a concrete part of all the announcements. And I think it's really, really crucial that we make sure that we have those announcements, and that will drive in all of those urbanizing areas, right? If you look at the millions and millions of people that are going to be living in the new cities, especially in the global south, making sure that we don't fall into the carbonized transportation gap, trap, I mean, is absolutely crucial. We need to provide for clean transportation, clean mobility through accessible, safe, and comfortable public transport, and through promoting active mobility. And I hope to be seeing a lot of messaging and a lot of concrete ideas and steps in that area.
Thanks very much. And as you say, Stientje, there is a lot going on right now. Marcelo, you are here with quite a large delegation from Brazil, civil society, private sector, academia, and of course, legislators. So what's the talk in the delegation about COP? You have to unmute yourself, Marcelo.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Some things never happen, never change. I think Brazil is beginning to really understand what all of this means, but mostly understand what role the country can play. Because a lot of countries have already done so much in terms of development, investments in energy, and sometimes not, because of the time, because of the lack of technology, not exactly ideal, and now they have to reinvest to change and to shift. Brazil is in the infancy of developing itself. It's a developing country. So it has the opportunity to leapfrog and spend the money once and more wisely, or at least with better technologies now, and reach a real strong play role in the world in terms of demonstrating how a country of this size can be sustainably developed. So I think Brazilian legislation, private sector, academia, all of it are beginning to understand. But to a point you just raised in terms of youth, I think this is the most impressive of all findings I see in my country. The younger generation really gets it. So that's the main reason I'm being accused to be an optimistic, because I really believe the young generation got it, and they are completely focused on that. So we messed it up, our generation, a couple before and one maybe after mine, but the new generation is really getting their role into fixing this. And the best we can do, and the least we can do, is bring our experience and our collaboration with them so they can fulfill this role. So I think Brazil, I'm really hopeful with Brazil. I think we are getting into our role of leading some of these changes and giving an example at real scale. I really believe the word solution comes with a lot of responsibility. Successful projects are very nice and benefit a lot of people, but in order to call it a solution, it needs to have the same scale of the problem. And that's the multi-trillion-dollar scale Nigel was talking about. We all know that. So I'm very optimistic, and I'm proud that Brazil is really moving towards the right direction.
That's fantastic. And I also have a very nice pavilion, one of the largest pavilions, I think, in that pavilion village further down the road from here. You mentioned the critical importance of youth, and I think because of the youth engagement and activism, there really has been a surge, an outbreak of optimism, and one can feel it here at the COP, and also the very active and impressive engagement of Indigenous peoples organizations and leaders. So looking ahead to tomorrow in the next couple of days, for Globe, of course, we have our major legislators summit, which is taking place at the Scottish Parliament. We're delighted to be working not just with the Scottish Parliament on this, but with the Children's Parliament and the Youth Parliament. And Scotland is unique in that it has a Children's Parliament and a Youth Parliament. And just last week, we organized with them a major innovation, an initiative across Scotland, whereby elected representatives, members of the Scottish Parliament, members of the Westminster Parliament met with their young people, their children in their constituencies, to talk about climate risk, climate dialogue. First time it's been held, and we hope to hold this in representative democracies the world over. But critically, these young people will be coming to report back to global legislators tomorrow. So we will keep you posted, because of course, at the same time, there's a lot of other youth action taking place by the youngos at the COP itself, and of course, off Broadway, so to speak, in the Green Zone and elsewhere within the city. So we will be bringing everybody around the table again collectively next week. I'm sorry that we have to bring things to a close earlier, because Deputy Sam Onuigbo, who was going to be joining us from the Nigerian Parliament and is here, and was also the sponsor for the climate change bill, which has passed both houses. We were very excited with the president's announcement 2 days ago, because that's a signal that that climate bill may be given presidential assent sooner rather than later. So these are the things which are happening in the legislative map in major countries around the world. We hope to bring him back for next Tuesday at our next webinar, but I'll bring things to a close now with your final thoughts. Stientje, let me begin with you on that. Your closing remarks for today's webinar, short and sweet.
Well, I would say optimism is a moral obligation. That would be my closing remark. And I see lots of reason for optimism here, but we need to combine optimism with scrutiny, and parliamentarians have a key role to play there. So make sure you scrutinize and make sure the optimism is translated into real results, and then we can continue on this path.
Thank you. I'm for that tough love in the optimism combined with the scrutiny, and not just the naivete that sometimes comes with being called an optimist. And Marcelo, over to you for your closing remarks.
Well, I'd like to just put my money where my mouth is, and mention that in logic and in sync with everything that we've discussed here today, and through the time, as I started my life in sustainability 10 years before the term was even carved, and we used to use government and subsidy money to do everything that's related to environment and nature and all that. Nowadays, well, some 12 years ago, I co-founded Earth Capital, which is a private equity firm. It exclusively does sustainable investments all over the world. This is a British company that it's now spread all over the world. And we can be one good example where we put all the money we have, ourselves and the clients' money, into that direction. And we have a very powerful tool called the Earth Dividend that measures, monitors, and reports transparently on 30 different aspects of the sustainability. Back to your point, Stientje, it's very important that we match optimism with reality and transparency. So that would be my closing remarks and to this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. Thank you to Stientje. Thank you earlier to Barry Gardiner, who was able to join us for a while. And thank you to everybody who's joined us online. We will be holding these webinars again next week on Tuesday, the 9th of November, with partners E3G and WRI. And just leaves me to remind everybody that we have details about the parliamentary events which are taking place across these 2 weeks with our partners, Climate Parliament, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, many others, Parliamericas, etc. And you can find the parliamentary calendar on the Globe website in the focal points section. So thank you once again for your insights, and look forward to picking up the conversation with you and others next week. Thank you again for everybody who's joined us online.
Thank you.
And have a very productive afternoon. Have a good call.
Likewise.
Bye-bye for now.